Thank you very much, Tina. And you can probably spot where the bags under the eyes have appeared over the past 6 or 7 years since the first meeting. Climate change, as Tina said, has slipped down the political and community agenda since then as we become more or less subsumed by economic concerns. But like many other issues, of course, in Irish society, it hasn't gone away, you know, and in fact it has come back to remind us in the past couple of weeks that the things we were worried about in 2007 still loom large and perhaps even loom larger than they were then. And that has come about largely because of the publication of the very influential IPCC report, which the first stage of which was only launched a couple of weeks ago. It's the product, as you know, of very extensive review among the whole international atmospheric science community, amongst the whole of the 120 member governments of the IPCC, who go through the report line by line and endorse it. So just like every other report since 1990, which comes out as a kind of a gold standard climate report every 7 years, every Irish government since 1990 has endorsed the IPCC findings, and therefore the leadership we look for is the leadership for them to implement the implications of that report in terms of policy. Just to give you a flavour of what the main headlines were to begin with, of course, the report is not saying anything sensational, nothing particularly new this time, but confirming with increasing certainty where we are at the moment in terms of global climate trends and in terms of the causes of those global climate trends. There's now no doubt but that unlike our forefathers who were prisoners of climate, who tried to save the hay, and sometimes didn't succeed because of the weather conditions, we are now the principal directors of future climate. And we know that that direction has been going towards warmer temperatures, it's been going towards more intense rainfall events, it's been going towards a more warmed zone, especially in the high latitude zones of Greenland and of Antarctica. And one of the findings of the report, really, I think that's worth mentioning here, is the newfound confirmation that Antarctica, far from being stable in terms of its ice mass, is now contributing a considerable amount of water to the global oceans every year. 215,000 million tons of water are melting from Antarctica every year. Melting from Greenland, 147,000 million tons from Antarctica. So we, not surprisingly therefore, are seeing an acceleration in sea level rise, roughly double what it was. We're seeing also changes taking place in global climate around the world, especially at the moment in terms of extreme events. And as Tina was saying, the drivers for that are quite clear. The drivers are certainly the changes in greenhouse gas loading. We know about that. We know also, of course, that we are at the moment on the more pessimistic of those variety of those options that you can see for the future. Just switch this on. A variety of those, well, maybe I won't switch it on, of those variety of scenarios that we know for the future. We're on perhaps the one which is the least acceptable at the moment globally. So we face problems down the road which perhaps are just as severe, maybe even more severe than we had in 2007. So when the IPCC look ahead, they say now we only have a 50% chance of avoiding 4 degrees of warming globally by the end of the century. And that 4 degrees will, of course, be further enhanced in the land masses of the Northern Hemisphere, of which we are essentially part. And we will see more changes in extremes taking place than we thought even 5 or 6 years ago. So those kinds of implications for temperature, reflected also in more intense rainfall events, have implications for all sorts of places, but also, of course, for sea level. And one of the findings of the IPCC report is to jack up the projections for sea level. Now we expect around about a metre, just under a metre by the end of this century. And if you bear that figure in mind, a metre rise in sea level is a metre rise in sea level for Dublin Bay as well. Just think of what that means in terms of vulnerability and in terms of forward planning. But the main message of the IPCC report, of course, is to confirm that the sceptical demands or the sceptical ideas about climate really are misplaced, And if you take the publishing climatologists of the world, those who really are into the topic, you'll find maybe 1 in 100 who disagrees with the notion of anthropogenically driven climate change at the moment. But it is fair to say that the community bears a very different perception of the role of climate change, and certainly scientifically we have lost the argument in convincing the public and also perhaps some of the policymakers about the importance of this problem. So we have failed in terms of leadership, in terms of getting that important message across, and that's something that has to be seriously worked on. I think you should also be very careful about sceptical statements that the last few years of more stable conditions represent an end to global warming. Certainly they don't if you look at that longer term trend. And you also have to be careful as to how you interpret trends. Trends, like statistics, can be used to convey many different ideas, sometimes contrary perspectives. And if you look at the global temperature trend here, you can see how by simply cherry picking where you start and finish, you can get very different conclusions, and conclusions which would be, in the longer term trend of climate, extremely erroneous. Why is it important to you as business people? Well, it's important because this represents an indirect cost which will come home to roost on most businesses over the next few decades, perhaps in a more serious way. The Stern report, of course, of 2006 had very sensible and very logically argued sort of statements about how much climate change will cost, how much damage costs there will be, and how much the option of amelioration or mitigation would be relative to that. And you can see that sometimes the figures are very large. 5% of GDP occurring each year if the more dramatic predictions of the IPCC come to pass. And that's a very serious figure to contemplate in terms of a reduction in demand, in terms of the problems of catering for a market, which you face in particular. But also there's a figure there of opportunity, and opportunities for exploiting a new emergent economy in low carbon technologies. You can see the suggestion of Stern, 500 billion by 2050. So here is where perhaps the future lies in terms of adapting to climate change. Now, Stern was criticised at the time as being perhaps too dramatic. This year, what does he say? Well, he says, if I had to do it again, I probably would be even more severe. I probably underestimated the risks. I probably made a little too little out of the possible damage costs of climate change. And that's occurring at the Davos summit in 2013, an indication that the problem is perhaps even more severe than he thought in 2006. Bringing it back down to Ireland, we know from the work we've been doing ourselves in Maynooth that we confirm the kind of IPCC prognosis for a mid-latitude country, and we know that Ireland is going to get warmer, especially in the east here, by mid-century, by another 1 or 2 degrees. We know also that Ireland is going to get wetter in the winter, especially in the west, and significantly drier in the summer, especially in the east. And this has implications for business. It has implications in terms of all sorts of costs that will come home to roost on you. It will come home to roost on you through new legislation. It will come home to roost on you through higher costs for resources such as water. And you can see the suggestion here for the EU as a whole is that not adapting to the future, not grasping the opportunities of adapting, of positioning Europe as a whole to climate change, is likely to be about 100 billion a year up by 2020, up to maybe double or 2.5 times that by mid-century. So it's not a problem that's going to go away. It's a problem that's going to get more and more severe. And of course, there is a social cost involved, and there's a cost of adaptation. And the cost of adaptation is very, very much less. That's the message of adaptation. Responding now, anticipating what's coming down the line, will cost business, will cost employers an awful lot less than waiting for the worst to happen. Because the costs are going to lie in the damage costs, in Cork here in 2009. I could have shown you Ballinasloe, I could have shown you Carrick-on-Shannon, I could have shown you any number of places. And those costs are very considerable. They're going to be very considerable, for example, also in terms of eking out dwindling resources during drier summer months. And here we're just showing you a small example of a catchment in County Meath, where you can start saying, well, what happens if we start economising on water? What happens if we start fixing the leaks? When does the pressure build up? When does the stress begin to appear? Those are the kind of forward planning decisions that everyone will have to make. Of course, we face problems in terms of our wider landscape with intangible assets, which are very hard to cost, but which have real value in terms of tourism, in terms of water supply, in terms of the intrinsic cultural characteristics of this island, which also face problems. And sometimes we don't help ourselves with what we're doing to remove valuable sequestration assets, such as peatlands, as you can see here. So there's a lot of issues which come up. Issues of species which are close to their southern limits in Ireland, which may well be under stress in the next few years. Issues of invasive species, which will come up where we don't really want the changing climate to encourage them to spread. Here you can see giant rhubarb on Achill Island spreading very widely, for example. And issues as well in terms of planning. We're going to have to worry about higher water tables in winter. So where are we going to put houses with septic tanks? Where are the vulnerable areas? Where will we have to have new planning restrictions? Where will we have to take measures, if you like, to anticipate future climate? Issues in construction. How much will we expect water penetration of concrete to increase with a windier and with a wetter climate in the future? Again, legislation and restrictions will inevitably come in, which will have to be tailored to different parts of Ireland. So it's necessary for business to start anticipating some of these issues because some of these structures will, of course, be around for the rest of this century. Perhaps the most obvious case, of course, is flooding in the coastal zone. 1 metre rise in sea level, plus the once-in-a-century high water level in this part of Ireland is 2.5 metres. So you're looking at vulnerability, and we can plot now very accurately how many addresses are at certain heights above sea level. You can see, for example, here that there are about 15,000 addresses in Dublin less than 3 metres above sea level. So if we have that once-in-a-century event, what kind of costs will be imposed, either in insurance costs, in damage costs, in loss of production, in loss of your activities? This is just a simple sum we did based on the 2009 floods. And very quickly you can begin to see how the values go up. Even with a 2 metre rise flood, the values go over €1 billion, for example, very quickly. So there are costs down the road which are there if you don't anticipate. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. Some sectors of the economy may actually do slightly better with climate changes. For example, the tourist industry, obviously. And you can see how the opportunities here for an extension of the shoulder season in the Irish tourist industry are coming out from the work we've done here, where May, for example, by mid-century becomes the same kind of tourist comfort month as June is today. And equally, there's an extension in September and to some extent into early October. So the opportunities for viability for some sectors are there to be exploited, to be anticipated, to take steps now to make plans for. And of course, a lot of this will go down to governance. It will go down to the local authorities. It will go down to people giving advice, giving the best guess they can of where the priorities should be, and businesses responding and businesses anticipating all of that. Tina talked about leadership, and sadly, at the moment, rather worryingly, our greenhouse gas emissions in Ireland are back on the rise again. They're rising in the middle of a recession, which is not very encouraging. It does make you wonder how things will go once the economy really begins to motor, hopefully in the next few years. But we have sectors that are really growing very quickly against the trend at the moment. And we will face costs from that as well. We have very fixed limits from our EU obligations in tonnages, which you can see here. Which you can see from 2013 onwards kick in to 2020. And if we don't meet those tonnages, we will face problems from our EU masters in terms of restrictions on how we can buy and sell quota, for example. Here's where we are in 2012. Here's where we were supposed to be in 2013. You can see there's a big gap there, and we're not really making progress towards achieving those EU obligations sufficiently fast to give confidence that we will achieve them. You will have costs down the road from further strategic figures that will come out for 2030 and 2040, and here the G8 and the EU have agreed these figures for the period up to 2050, and you can see it's an 80 to 95% reduction in CO2 that's required by that time period. Now that's a very, very difficult target for 35 years' time. It's a target that requires forward planning now and beginning to smooth the road at least as far as possible. Negotiations have already begun on the 2030 target, which will be finalised by the end of this year by the Commission. But they are challenging targets, and they are the targets that are necessary for the world to avoid dangerous climate change. And that is the ultimate reason for them. Without achieving those targets, sustainability means very little in terms of the global economy. We face unforeseen problems if we don't achieve those kinds of targets. So the jockeying for position has begun. At a national level, the jockeying for how much of the national emissions cake will different sectors of the Irish economy get in 2050. And I just wanted to show you some of the figures that are emerging from current government thinking on which sectors will get how much of the national cake in emissions by 2050. Energy, zero. Decarbonised. No emissions. Transport, zero. Decarbonised, no emissions. Now think of what that means. It means no filling stations. It means no petrol. It means no fuel based on fossil fuels. Where's it going? Not to residential. Zero in residential. No gas burners, no oil burners. Houses based solely on electrical energy. The lobbying has begun, and business needs to be aware of where that lobbying is going on, because who's going to get the lion's share of national emissions in the non-traded sector in Ireland in 2050 at the moment? That's where it's going. So there is, I think, a wake-up call for people to think about where are they going in their various sectors, what positioning do they see for your particular business over the next few years. I want to compliment the organisation here because they made a very impressive and very detailed submission to the committee, the Oireachtas Committee, considering the forthcoming climate change and low carbon development bill. The main points you can see there are all very sensible, very well articulated. The oral submission was made in a very effective way, and this is an organisation which I think is one of the organisations showing the necessary leadership which Tina referred to. And I just want to compliment you on that, because I think it's a very impressive display indeed. Finally then, and I know I'm down to my last minute, finally, just to say that if we don't move, if Europe doesn't move, if Ireland doesn't move, the risk is that we will be left behind in this story, because other countries have already begun to make changes. Other countries which perhaps you might have thought would be the laggards have begun to reform. Even President Obama's United States of America, which has, if you like, been left behind in a lot of the international debates on climate change, has now moved. So the takeaway message I suppose I want to leave you with today is that it's necessary to adapt. It's necessary to make forward planning in this area, and in the words of the old budget travel advert which you used to see on the bus shelters and the posters, don't get left behind. Thank you. Thank you.